about how I cheated on my husband, lied about getting pregnant, and left with all his money. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. Oh, this is gonna be a good one, you guys. A little background, my husband and I met 2 years ago. And lucky for me, he's a wealthy plastic surgeon. So a little backstory. I actually met him because I wanted to get a nose job. I made an appointment in his office and I went. We actually hit it off right away, even though he's older than me and, you know, wasn't the best looking. After the appointment, I decided I would get the nose job. A few days later, I get a phone call. Guess who it is? It's the wealthy plastic surgeon who I just saw. He asked me out on a date and I said yes, of course. By the way, at the time I was a sugar baby, so I had a few sugar daddies. I figured he would just become another sugar daddy. He took me out to the best restaurant in town, and you better believe I ordered the most expensive thing on the menu. After my surgery, he would bring me food and was just really nice. Then he asked me to be his girlfriend and I decided to give him a chance. I even broke up with 2 sugar daddies to make space for him. That's when I asked my boyfriend for an allowance. He said of course. There's so much more to this story. Part 2 is up. Part 2 about how I cheated on my husband, lied about being pregnant, oh yeah, and stole all of his money. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. This was sent to me on Instagram. So like I said in part 1, I had asked him for an allowance. Of course he said yes and offered me $3,000 a month. I accepted even though it was on the low end. By the way, I still had 1 sugar daddy at this time. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I was pretty obsessed with the Kardashians. My goal in life is to look like Kim K. So now that I had a plastic surgeon boyfriend, I decided to ask him what other surgeries he thinks I could do. I already had my nose job. Now I definitely wanted to do some other stuff on my body. But when I told him, he got really upset. He said I didn't need to change anything about me and that I needed to stop looking for attention from other men. That's when I told him that would be totally impossible and that I definitely was going to keep my other sugar daddy. He totally flips out because he didn't know I had a sugar daddy. Then he asked me if I was actually in love with him. I told him that love would grow eventually, but that I really did like him. Then he started playing hard to get, like he wanted me to apologize and beg him, but I was not the type. So we ended up not speaking for a few weeks. Eventually he comes over to my apartment and asks me what surgeries I want to get done. And back to the surgery table I went. Part 3 is up. Part 3 about how I cheated on my husband, lied about being pregnant, oh yeah, and stole all of his money. Well, almost all of it. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So my plastic surgeon boyfriend decides to do more plastic surgery on me. But this time, it was free. We decided to get my bum done. Again, during the healing process, he was a total angel and brought me food and took care of me. Yeah, he was also paying for all of my bills and my rent this time, even though I still had a sugar daddy. And he knew it. A few months passed and he asked me to go to Italy with him. Of course I said yes. We stayed at a beautiful place in Tuscany and then he asked me to marry him. He had planned out this whole romantic dinner and of course I had to say yes. But on one condition, that I let go of my last sugar daddy. So I told him I would, although I actually did not. So we started planning my dream wedding. We finally got married and I moved into his mansion. Then he told me that I had to get pregnant right away. His excuse is that he's in his 50s and he really wants to have kids. I said I wanted to have a baby too, but I kept taking the pill. I mean, I am just not ready to have kids or to ruin my beautiful body. This is when my other sugar daddy started getting really annoyed because I never spent time with him. It was really hard being torn between 2 men. Part 4 is up. Part 4 about how I cheated on my husband, lied about being pregnant, and stole all of his money. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So like I said, my sugar daddy was starting to get really annoyed at me because I never spent enough time with him. That's when I broke it to him that I was actually married. He totally flipped out, called me a user, cut me off, and blocked me from everything. So that meant I was not getting money from this sugar daddy at all. It meant I was totally dependent on my husband. Remember I said my husband wanted me to get pregnant? Well, I kept taking the pill because I didn't want to get pregnant. But my husband would ask me every single day how that was going. And I was like, it's going. I even started lying, saying that I was going to go to the baby doctor just to get myself checked, and I really wouldn't. Instead, I would go have lunch and shop. Around this time, an old sugar daddy of mine contacted me, who I still had a crush on. He was like super good looking. He offered me some money and asked me if I wanted to go on a few dates, so of course I said yes. I accepted because I really wanted to just separate myself financially from my husband. I didn't want to be dependent on him all the time. So when my husband was at work, I would go out on dates with this new sugar daddy. The sugar daddy wanted me to go on a trip with him, and I had to say no. He got really upset and started asking questions. Of course, I didn't tell him that I was married, but he started getting really suspicious. He also started to catch feelings really quick. Like, he always wanted to be with me. He would text me all the time. And that's when my husband finds a text message from the sugar daddy. I basically denied everything and I told him that I no longer had any sugar daddies, but my husband did not believe me. That's when he calls my sugar daddy from my phone and tells him to leave me alone. And the sugar daddy told him that only I could make that decision. So I basically had to cut off the sugar daddy right in front of my husband. My husband was like really angry at this time, so I was on my best behavior for the next few weeks. But after a few weeks, he was still really angry, so I realized I needed to start taking money out of the account that he gave me. So I started transferring money from his account to my account, and then from my account to another account at a different bank. And guess what? My husband did not notice one bit. He had several other accounts and investments and all this other stuff, so he never really noticed if anything went missing from that one account. After a few months, I had $50,000 in that bank account. I knew it wasn't enough, so I had to start taking more money out. And then a few months after that, I was at $120,000. I knew this was enough to get me a little house somewhere and just like basically live by myself. That's when I devised a whole plan. Would leave the country and buy myself a house. Even started looking for a real estate agent in other countries. But then the poo hit the fan. My husband found my pills and asked me if I was actually trying to get pregnant or not. Once again, I started lying and I told him that of course I wanted to have a baby with him. Then he insisted we go to the doctor together. That's when he found out that I had not gone to the doctor once. He told me that if I didn't want kids, we would have to get a divorce, so I told him that I didn't want kids. That's when I told him I wanted a divorce and that I only wanted half of his stuff. He started laughing in my face and left. I knew I had to act quick because it was a matter of time before he found out I stole all that money. The very next day, I booked a flight and left. He started blowing up my phone, asking me where I was, calling me. Then he started threatening me for taking all the money in the bank account and that he hired private investigators to find me. Now I'm considering going back to him, but I honestly don't know what to do. I got myself a cute little house and even found a new sugar daddy. But I know he's still looking for me. What should I do, you guys? I think I really messed up, you guys. Story time about how I'm hopelessly in love with my boss and I'm about to be a homewrecker, but help me! Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So I've been working for my boss for 3 months. He's in the tech world and he makes lots of money, and he hired me as a personal assistant. He's got a wife and 3 kids. They've been married for 15 years, and he's 18 years older than I am. One day my friend told me that this guy was looking for a personal assistant, and I applied for the job. I had my first interview, and right away I was super attracted to him, and I could tell that he was attracted to me. Like, you know, when you like someone and, you know, there's just a vibe between you guys. He then called me in for a second interview, and in this interview we basically spoke about everything he would want me to do and what the job entailed. I mostly had to run his schedule and set up meetings for him with clients and different things like that. So it's not like I was getting him his laundry or running errands for him. A few days later he calls me and tells me that I got the job. He offered me a lot of money, more than it was advertised at the beginning when I went for the interview. So I took the job. But here's the thing. From the time I did my first interview, I had not stopped thinking about this man. Like, I already had feelings for him before I even started working for him. So I decided to dress really cute for my first day, and he noticed. I mean, I was playing this man like a fiddle. My goal was to get him to fall for me. After the first week, he asked me to go to lunch with him to celebrate the fact that I had been doing a good job. Of course, I said yes. Went to this beautiful restaurant and had wine. We then went back to his office and I went home. Later on, he sends me a text message saying that he's so proud of me for doing such a good job. Fast forward a few weeks, I kept flirting, he kept flirting back. Finally, at the end of the month, we went to another lunch. This is when he opened up to me and told me that he was attracted to me. I told him I was attracted to him too. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how I'm hopelessly in love with my boss and I'm about to be a homewrecker, so I need your guys' help. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. After my first month of working there, he took me out to lunch and decided to tell me that he was attracted to me. So of course I confessed to him that I was attracted to him as well. I mean, duh, it was so obvious. At this point, I had done everything in my power to make him fall in love with me. I wore the cutest outfits, always did my hair and makeup. If I went to Starbucks, I would always get him a drink as well, and I would even bring him home-cooked meals sometimes. So in other words, I went out of my way to make him see that I am totally wifey material. And yes, I was always aware that he was married and had kids, but he didn't look happy with his wife. She never came to the office, and they never spent any time together. And according to him, she had an affair last year, and he's pretty sure that she's back with the guy that she was having an affair with. First, I didn't know whether to believe him or not, but then he showed me screenshots of messages that she had sent to this guy. That's when he asked me if I wanted to go have lunch again. Then he asked me to go to the movies, and we made out the entire time. So I'm sitting there making out with my boss. That's when he tells me that we have to keep this hush-hush, because if the company finds out, he will be in major trouble and so will I. But he's a high earner in the company, so he can't be messing around. This would ruin his life. Ever since the first kiss, he basically treats me like his work girlfriend. And every day for lunch, we go out to a restaurant just to get to know each other. It's the only time we have together. About a week ago, he asked me if I would be willing to marry him if he divorced his wife. I said yes right away, but honestly, I'm not sure if I want him to leave his wife for me. And his kids. I never thought of myself as a homewrecker. Well, because I said yes, he said that we should try to find a way to tell his wife. I mean, I don't even want to meet this woman, and he wants both of us to talk to her. I told him we should wait at least a few months before we do that. That's when he got me a new apartment. That way, when he leaves his wife, he's already got a place to stay. And of course, he wants to live with me right away. It's a luxury apartment and I love it. Part 3 is up. Part 3 of how I'm hopelessly in love with my boss and I'm about to be a homewrecker. So yes, I need your guys' help. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So now that he got me my new luxury apartment, which I'm totally in love with. By the way, I have a sauna in my shower. He wants us to plan out how we're going to tell his wife. Like I said in part 2, I don't know if I want him to leave his wife for me. I mean, I see a future with him, but do I really want him to leave his wife and his kids for me? He even wants to start planning the wedding. He wants to move in together right away, plan the wedding, and get married. He promises me that his kids will love me and that his wife won't have a problem because she's already having an affair with someone else. But I feel like that's just him being hopeful and it's really not going to be that easy. So I opened up to my family and I told them what's going on. My mom told me that as long as he leaves his wife and everything is good with the kids, then we should feel free to be together. But ultimately, she doesn't want me to be a homewrecker. I definitely feel like things are going way too fast. I mean, tomorrow we're gonna go taste a bunch of cakes at a really nice bakery. Oh yeah, and he even took me shopping for a wedding ring. He wants to buy me one that's $40,000. It's 3.2 carats. So unfortunately, now that I told my family, a few cousins found out what was happening. And one of my cousins reached out to my ex. She told him what was happening and he called me to ask me not to marry this guy. He says we can work on our relationship. But let me tell you, this ex was totally toxic. He would monitor everything I would do. He never let me have friends, and he didn't even allow me to have Instagram. Oh yeah, and he's kind of broke. I mean, I was the one paying for most of the stuff in the relationship, so I don't even know if I want to open that can of worms again. But part of me thinks he's right. Like, I shouldn't be rushing into this. But on the other hand, I found myself a wonderful man. He's so loving, caring, so generous, and he's actually super fun to be with too. I've never felt more secure in a relationship before, and I know that most women would love to be with him too. What do you guys think I should do?
Story time about how my boyfriend was plotting to kill me. So this was around my senior year in high school. Me and my friend Jessica were out at this restaurant and we ran into this really cute dude. My friend Jessica was like, girl, you should go over there and talk to him. Now, I usually didn't do this, but for this one, I made an exception. So I went over and asked his name. He told me his name was Mike. He was so charming and we exchanged numbers instantly. Now, we only exchanged numbers after talking for about 10 minutes. Once I got cool vibes from him, it was a wrap. Once I went back to my friend Jessica, I was so excited that I actually got his number and we started to text immediately. So I went home and we were texting and I was telling him about the school that I went to and just basic conversation. We texted all day into the night. So the next day, he took me on a date and we went to this really nice restaurant. So that next Monday came around, I ran into Jessica and was telling her how much fun we had. That Monday at school, I ran into Jessica and she looked so disturbed, like for part 2. This is part 2 about how my boyfriend was plotting to kill me. So like I said in part 1, I ran into Jessica that Monday at school and she looked so disturbed for some reason. I was like, hey girl, we had so much fun on our date. What's wrong? She was like, girl, Mike is here. I don't know why she looked so disturbed. I was excited to find out he was going to our school. But once I told her how happy I was about it, she was happy for me. So to fast forward the story, Mike and I started dating and we're dating for about a month now. So out of nowhere, Mike started acting really weird and telling me how he was a dry texter all of a sudden. And how he wouldn't text me, he would only talk to me if I saw him in person. I just assumed he wanted to hang out more, so I started going to his house more. I started spending the night at his house more often and we started going to school together. But I definitely noticed something was off when I would go to sleep. Anytime I woke up in the middle of the night to check my phone or to go use the restroom, I would notice he was just up staring at me in the bed. This gets crazy, like for part 3. Part 3 about how my boyfriend was plotting to kill me. So like I said in part 2, I noticed stuff was kind of weird. Every time I woke up to check my phone, he was always up in the bed just staring at me. So one morning, I set my alarm 30 minutes earlier than I usually do so I can get up for school earlier. I noticed he wasn't in the bed, so I'm using my flashlight and I'm just walking around the room, looking in the closet, trying to find out where he went. So I checked the restroom, he's not in there. I checked the bed, under it, the closet, he's not there either. So as I'm walking down the stairs, he's coming up the stairs. He had boots on, a leather jacket, sweats, and gloves. He was holding a knife and he had a big trash bag with him. I was like, Mike, what are you doing? He says, oh, I just didn't want to wake you up, but I was getting ready to take the trash out early. Him having a knife did not make sense to me, so I turned around and I took off running upstairs. He then screamed, let me explain why he was trying to stab me. I jumped out of the window in the bathroom, then later, once I got home, I found out his name wasn't even Mike and he was a serial killer. Story time about how I found out my mom faked her death so she wouldn't have to be our parent anymore. So it was me and my brother Jeremy, and after I turned about 5, my mom started complaining that she was getting sick and couldn't go back to work. She was always bedridden and she was always having people make food for us, and she was just never really attentive like that. So here and there she would have this random black car come pull up to the house, and she always told us that she was going to appointments. So that's what we believed. She would come back and just keep us posted and say that the doctor gave her prescription and that she should be fine. As the years went on, me and my brother Jeremy, who was younger than me, he was 12 and I was 15 at this time, we just started taking care of her for the rest of our lives. We barely had a social life or really any social skills or normal high school experience because we felt like our mom could die any second. And she would always tell us, don't you notice how much weight I'm losing? Because the clothes that she would wear were really big. So one morning, that same black car came and got her and she went to the hospital and she never came back, like for part 2. This is part 2 about how my mom faked her own death. So like I said in part 1, that black car came and supposedly took her to the hospital, but she never came back. So of course, me and my younger brother Jeremy were curious about why she wasn't coming back. So after a whole week of our aunt babysitting us, we kept asking her, where's our mom? And she looked so uncomfortable and cringy every time she told us that, oh, she's still in the hospital. So it's officially been 2 weeks and my aunt got a weird phone call in the middle of the night. She woke up me and my little brother Jeremy and told us that our mom had passed away from an unknown disease. So only about 5 to 10 minutes after me and Jeremy were crying, our aunt went to her bedroom. I dropped out of school and everything because it just made me depressed that my entire life my mom was sick. So sometime later, I asked my aunt about the funeral and she said that she was going to be cremated, so there would be no funeral. So after my mother was cremated, my aunt kept the urn locked in a cabinet and said we weren't allowed to touch it ever. This gets bad, like for part 3. Part 3 about how my mama faked her own death. So like I said in part 2, we weren't allowed to touch the urn. My aunt kept it locked away in a cabinet. I was 15 at the time, but as some years went on, I turned 18, and I just wanted to see it. After all, it was my mom's. So one day, for some reason, I just couldn't sleep, and I was staying up extremely late. I heard my aunt getting ready to leave the house, so I decided to stay up to see where she was going. I looked out of the window, and the same mysterious black car that used to pick my mom up when I was 5 came to pick her up. That was weird, so after she left, I started looking around through all of her mail, all of her clothes for that key. So I found the key to the urn, and I went to the urn, unlocked it, and you will never guess what I found in there. It was flour. It wasn't even ashes. She put flour in the urn. That's why we weren't allowed to touch it. Once I got used to my aunt's schedule, I followed her next time. So as I'm spying through this weird house, I see my aunt talking to my mom. Once I screamed at both of them for a good hour, I found out that my mom paid my aunt to pretend that she was dead. She wanted a fresh start at life, but instead went to jail. Creepy baby story time. So Jonathan and Marie were high school sweethearts who later got married and tried to have kids. They had been trying for 5 whole years, and she miscarried 3 times. After a while, they were about to look into adoption because it was just taking too much work. Then they tried praying and seeing a specialist, a counselor, because it was making their marriage pretty tough. After the doctors telling her something was wrong with her reproductive system, they went home and just cried. A week later, she started feeling weird cramps in her stomach. She went to the hospital because she just didn't think she could have been pregnant after all those tries. But when the doctor said she was pregnant, she almost passed out in disbelief and excitement. She went home, and when her husband got off work, she couldn't wait to tell him the great news. They were crying with happiness. So as time went on, they started going to the doctor, getting regular checkups, and everything was going all right. Then at a certain time, the baby was supposed to be bigger than it actually was, and they told them that the baby wasn't growing at its proper speed. They had her take certain vitamins and told her not to worry, like for part 2. Part 2, creepy baby story time. So like I said in part 1, she started taking vitamins just to make sure everything went properly. So about 6 months into her pregnancy, she was just frightened because that baby was not big enough. For some reason, the doctors kept telling her that she had nothing to worry about, so she just took their word for it. She didn't want to overstress because stress isn't good for pregnant women. For some reason, after those 6 months, the baby really started to pick up speed and grow at a normal pace. So boom, delivery day was here. It was time for her to give birth. So delivery day comes, she pushes the baby out, everything seems normal, takes his first breath, and they're excited. So eventually the mom goes and takes a nap with the baby. Jonathan also slept at the hospital with them. So they woke up to this weird noise from the baby. It wasn't crying, but it was just weird. The baby was speaking English. It was saying mommy. The baby was speaking and it had just been born. 2 weeks later, that baby took his first step. Long story short, this baby graduated high school at 13, and it was me. This story time is about how my boss tried to kill me. So I was about 26 years old, had my degree from college, and was starting this brand new office job. Unfortunately, I had to relocate, therefore I had no family there. So on the very first day, I get my office. So I'm settling in, and my boss walks in. He introduced himself as Mr. Seacrest, but told me I could call him Jerry, which was his first name. No lie, that was a little weird because I just met the man. So as I get my first set of papers to work on, I notice that he keeps walking by my window, so I just casually kept waving at him. A little while later, somebody else walks by my window, and I kind of thought it was him, but it was a woman this time. She knocked on my door and asked if she could come in. I was like, yeah, sure. So she walks in, introduces herself. Her name was Sandy, and she was like, you want to go on lunch together? So I was like, of course, let's go. So once we get to lunch, she starts filling me in on people, the hot news, and all the gossip. Then she asks, so who's your boss? I said, Jerry. She goes, Mr. Seacrest? I'm like, oh yeah, him. Like for part 2. This is part 2 about how my boss tried to kill me. So like I said in part 1, I went on lunch with Sandy. She's filling me in on everything, and boom. I tell her that, yeah, I know Mr. Seacrest. She goes, oh, so I'm assuming he said you could call him by his first name too, huh? I'm like, yeah, that's kind of weird. Does he always do that? She says, yeah, but only to the girls he's trying to get to know personally, if you know what I mean. I'm not really into sleeping with my boss, so I wasn't with it. So then she tells me about the story with this girl named Marla that used to work there and got fired. She goes, yeah, Mr. Seacrest, he was interested in her as well. But the girl thought that if they got closer, then she'd get promoted. Turns out he started to get really aggressive, follow her around, and make sure she wasn't talking to any of the other employees, aka the males. Once she started to become afraid of him, she tried to report him. Once he got word that she was trying to get rid of him, he got her fired. In the middle of her telling me this story, I see Mr. Seacrest walking up. I say, change the topic, like for part 3. Part 3 about how my boss tried to kill me. So as Mr. Seacrest, or Jerry, walks up, I tell her to change the topic quick. So she says, okay, well, that was all I wanted to tell you. I have to go. So Mr. Seacrest comes up to me, he sits in her spot. He says, hey, I'd like to take you to lunch and just talk over your new position with you. Now, honestly, since I didn't know the girl who was telling me this story, I wasn't taking it word for word. So I went to lunch with him to talk things over. He was very funny, and we exchanged numbers. So me and Mr. Seacrest went out to lunch a few more times, and one lunch got kind of weird. He says, okay, so now that we know each other very well, I was thinking I'd ask you something. He asked me to do him a favor, if you know what I mean. I told him how I felt like that was inappropriate and I would like to get back to work. Then he says, well, I'm your boss, so you won't have any work if you don't do what I'm asking. I try to get out of his car, then he locks the doors. So I say, okay, whatever you want, just bring me back to my job, please. As soon as he brings me back, I jump out of the car and I jump into mine and speed off. Then he starts chasing me, trying to run me off of the highway. He crashes me and almost tips me over. I was then able to call the police. They tracked him down and arrested him.
Story time about how my crazy neighbors ate my dog. By the way, this is an anonymous story from a follower. So me and my boyfriend had just bought our first house together. Everyone welcomed us to the new neighborhood, but we didn't have neighbors to the right side of us yet. No one was in the house yet. So about 6 months into us living there, we get our brand new neighbors. So obviously, since we've been there for 6 months, we introduced ourselves to them. So our neighbors were these two grown men. They didn't even have any furniture in their house, so that kind of stood out. We thought later they'd get moving trucks and move in some furniture, but they never did. So me and my boyfriend had a Pomeranian named Chippy. Sometimes we would let our dog go outside to use the restroom, and every time I went outside to get the dog, I noticed our neighbors were just staring at me. So one day I let Chippy go outside to use the restroom, and when I was ready to bring him back in, I couldn't find him anywhere. So I'm looking around, I'm literally looking everywhere, and he is nowhere to be found. So I go back into the house to tell my boyfriend, and then a few minutes later we get a knock on the door. And it's both of our neighbors like, hey, we found your dog in your front yard. Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how my crazy neighbors ate my dog. By the way, this is an anonymous story. So after our neighbors bring by our dog, we started to get suspicious for sure. Things just weren't adding up at all. So one day a kid across the street saw our dog Chippy and wanted to play with him. So I said, of course, only if you make sure nothing happens. Obviously, I didn't think anything would happen. That kid loved our dog. So as the kid is playing with our dog Chippy, the neighbors are looking out of the window watching him. So they come outside of their house and they go, hey, can I play with him? And the boy says, yeah, but you can't let anything happen to him. Then our neighbor goes, oh, of course not. I play with Chippy all the time. The boy then goes, okay, well, I have to go home now. Make sure Chippy gets back to his owner. He says, of course, nothing's going to happen to Chippy. So the boy goes back into his house, and our neighbors bring Chippy inside of their house. So after about an hour or so, I go outside to see what's going on. Chippy is missing yet again. Like for part 3. Part 3 story time about how my neighbors ate my dog. So once I go outside to look for my dog, I notice he's not there and neither was the kid. So I go to the kid's house across the street to see if maybe he brought the dog home. Then he says, no, I gave him to your neighbors. He said he'd give him back to you. My stomach dropped because I do not trust my neighbors. So I go to my neighbor's house and I'm banging on the door and they don't answer. So I go get my boyfriend. Then he comes out and he's banging on the door demanding that they come out. They never answer. So we call the police. Once the police are called, they get there and they bang on the door and then they answer. The police noticed that they had no furniture and the lights were off, so they became suspicious. A second police officer pulls up and he claims that he recognizes them. And he tells me that they're 2 homeless men. They don't even actually live there. They broke in. As they were looking around in the house, they found Chippy's collar and they also found remains of a dog. Meaning they ate our dog. That explains why they kept watching him. They were arrested on many charges. Best/worst date ever. So I was in a relationship with this guy who was very emotionally / physically abusive sometimes. He was so insecure, like literally anytime I was even on my phone, he would take it from me just to see who was keeping my attention. So one day this guy DMs me and he's telling me how beautiful I am and how much he'd like to get to know me. After exchanging messages with him a few times, I could tell he had pure intentions. I felt so guilty but so afraid because I didn't want my original boyfriend to find out. He would have tried to kill me. So instead of DMing, I told him to just email me so it'd be less suspicious. So after talking for a few weeks, I tried to call things off because I was catching real feelings for him. He made me feel so much better than my boyfriend ever did. So once I told him the type of person that I was and how bad I'd feel for cheating on my boyfriend, I called things off. By the way, his name was Carter, and my boyfriend's name was Jackson. So some weeks went by without me speaking to Carter, and Valentine's Day came up. So Jackson takes me to this fancy restaurant. Once we're seated, I recognize someone there. Like for part 2. Part 2 about my best/worst date ever. By the way, this is an anonymous story. So once me and Jackson get seated, I recognize this guy. I can only see the side of his face, but he definitely looked familiar. So every so often I would look over there to see if I recognized him from somewhere. So as I was looking at him one other time, he looked at me and we caught eye contact for a split second. Then it hit me. It was Carter. Carter was the guy who DM'd me, and he's literally
at the same restaurant as I am. So Jackson starts to notice that I'm distracted by something and he's looking behind him trying to see who I'm looking at. So he goes, "Why the F are you looking around the restaurant for? I'm your boyfriend. I took you on this date and you're being so ungrateful." So as Jackson's trying to see who I'm looking at, Carter turns around and looks at me again. And he goes, "Are you okay?" Jackson then goes, "Are you making eyes at this guy?" And he takes his whole drink and throws it in my face. He stands up making a scene, yelling and cursing at me. So Carter came over there, like for part 3. Part 3 about my worst/best date ever. By the way, the story is anonymous. So once Carter comes over there to see if I'm okay, Jackson stands up ready to fight him. So the girl that Carter was sitting with runs over there. And she goes, "Who is this girl and why are you trying to fight her?" Carter simply says she's in trouble and her boyfriend is treating her like crap. So she goes, "Well, if you care more about her, then you can just be with her." Then she leaves. So Carter and Jackson get into a fight and they're on top of the table, slamming the food everywhere. I got salad on me, drinks on me, everything, you name it. So after the waiter split us up, they put everybody out. After we were out, Carter demanded that I get in his car and not in Jackson's. Jackson threatened to kill me if I got in his car, so Carter called the police. Once the police showed up, Jackson was arrested for threatening my life. Once me and Carter sat in his car for hours, we were connecting with everything. I honestly hadn't been that happy in forever. Long story short, that story was 2 years ago, and we're going to tell it to our soon-to-be-born child.
Story time about how I shot my boyfriend's eggplant. I was a sophomore in college at this time with my boyfriend Michael and my best friend Serenity. One day my best friend Serenity buzzed down my college dorm room and was crying hysterically. She was telling me she just came back from the doctors and got terrible news. Her boyfriend Brad cheated on her and gave her herpes. She felt so embarrassed and I promised her I wouldn't tell anybody. So I told my boyfriend that Serenity was starting to have relationship problems and we should probably be there for her more. So every now and then Michael would say, "Hey babe, I'm going to go check on Serenity," and he would hang out with her by herself, which I had absolutely no problem with. But then later on they started to hang out without me without even telling me that they were hanging out. I honestly felt like I had nothing to worry about knowing the circumstances. And my boyfriend, he was not a cheater, so I thought. So one day I was taking a shower and as I was washing down there, stuff started to burn. I hopped out of the shower, sat on the toilet to take a good look, and I had bumps. These were not razor bumps, they were bumps. So I went to my doctor immediately, like for part 2. This is part 2 about how I shot my boyfriend's eggplant. So like I said in part 1, I went to the doctors so quick. Once they tested me for everything, they told me that I should have my results in about 2 to 3 days. 2 to 3 days later exactly, I got my results. I had herpes. Once I read that I tested positive, I knew exactly where it came from. So I called my boyfriend and I said, "Hey, where are you?" He goes, "Oh, I was just checking on Serenity again." I said, "Okay, well, I'm going to go to class now." I was lying. I was on my way to see what the hell they were doing. So once I get to Serenity's, I bust down the door and you guessed it, they were doing it. So Michael hops off Serenity trying to run to me, apologizing, "Babe, I'm so sorry." I had my dad's gun and I shot his eggplant. I was just like, "You won't be needing that anymore because, boo, you got herpes." He would have never slept with her if he knew she had herpes, but that just exposed the fact that he's a cheater. Oh, and for Serenity, I whooped that ass. Herpes was the last thing she was worried about. If my life was going to be ruined, then so was theirs. Story time about how I slept with my own dad. By the way, this story is anonymous. Now, keep in mind, I never knew who my dad was from birth, but I knew he lived in the same state as me. So I was a senior in college and it was getting so hard for me to graduate. So one day I went in early to speak with our professor about the homework, and we had a new professor. I was so upset because our other professor was so lenient with me. He understood everything. I was going to have to catch this new dude up on everything. I was hoping he wasn't strict, but just like I thought, he was extremely strict. He went by Professor Tom, which was his first name because he said it made him feel old to go by his last. So graduation started coming up and I was talking to my best friend like, "Girl, what should I do?" I was failing so many of my classes, it was just so hard. Then when I told her we had a new professor, she was like, "Oh, girl, you screwed." So once me and her got to class the next day, she was like, "Oh, girl, he is cute." She's like, "You know what you're going to have to do by the end of the semester if you're still failing, right?" Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how I slept with my biological father. By the way, this story is very anonymous. So my best friend was suggesting that I had to sleep with him to pass my classes. I did not want to take it there, but by the way my grades was looking, I had no choice. So I asked him to start tutoring me after classes. He agreed to tutor me and I got a lot closer to him. So one day I came in for tutoring and I locked the door. I told him I had a surprise for him just to show appreciation for him helping me. He was like, "And what is that?" Long story short, we did the do on his desk. Both had a great time. After that, my grades were not a problem. So the next day I was freaking out telling my best friend everything that happened. And she was kind of happy for me. So after classes I went home and my mom told me my dad was coming over for dinner. She was like, "Honey, he's moved closer to us so he can get closer to you." She goes, "He actually just started teaching after college." My stomach hit the floor. Oh, I hear someone knock on the door and I am sweating. She opens the door. It's my professor. I blacked out and I don't remember anything after that. Story time about how I found out my dad was a racist. This story is anonymous. I have no idea where my dad is. So all my life I went to all white schools, and I mean all white. But my freshman year of high school, there was this one black guy there and his name was Terrell. He was so fine. All of the girls thought he was cute, but they didn't want to be judged by the white boys for dating a black guy. There was so much racism in my school, it was disgusting. So I wanted to make him more comfortable, so I introduced myself to him and started hanging out with him. As we got to know each other, we started to like each other, and he asked me to be his girlfriend. I did not hesitate to say yes because I was not concerned about my parents not liking him. So one day after school, I went home and I announced to my parents the big news. So I brought them in the living room, sat them down, and I told them I had a boyfriend. They were so happy for me, but my dad was like, "Who's the guy?" So I go, "His name is Terrell," and before I could finish, my dad's like, "Terrell? So he's a black guy?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Okay, cool, bring him over for dinner." Like for part 2. This is part 2 story time about how I found out my dad was a racist. This story is anonymous. So after my dad was like, "Oh, so he's black?" That definitely stood out to me. I'm like, "Why did you say it like that?" He's like, "Oh, I just want to recognize the guy who's dating my daughter." I was like, okay. So the next weekend I bring Terrell over for dinner. My dad is eyeing him down like a hawk, but I thought he was just being a typical dad. So after dinner was over, everything went pretty smoothly. My dad then goes, "Hey Terrell, let's go for a walk man to man." Terrell looks at me with fear in his eyes, only because he's my dad. So my dad goes in the basement and gets his backpack with some stuff in it. Then they head outside. 15 minutes later, Terrell's texting me like, "You need to come quick. Something is wrong with your dad and I'm not comfortable." It took me about 10 minutes to get there, and once I got there, they were behind some trees in a park. Before I even got there, I could hear N-word this and N-word that. As soon as I located them, I saw my dad on top of Terrell, telling him he would never be good enough for me. I kicked my dad so hard in the balls. I could not believe my dad was this way. I grabbed Terrell and we ran. I left home and stayed with him and his parents, who've been together ever since.
This story time is about how my friends tried to drown me. By the way, this story is anonymous. So my dad's job relocated him, and that meant we had to go to a new school. I was trying so hard to fit in, I ended up finding the wrong crowd. First day comes around and I'm at lunch. And this boy named Raul comes up to me asking me if I'm doing okay. So we start chatting it up, and I notice these 5 girls see us at the table. Walk up to the table and just interrupt our conversation and say, "Hey girl." Then this one blonde girl named Sarah asked me, "Do you know him?" Like, "No, I just met him." And she's like, "Well, I see that you're new, so you can hang out with us, okay?" I was so happy because I had a group of friends on the first day. Sometime later, me and Raul start to like each other. I told my new friends who I liked. And Sarah, which was the queen bee of the group, she goes, "So you guys are liking each other?" I was like, "Yeah." She goes, "Well, I mean, that was my ex, but who cares?" I'm like, "Girl, I don't have to have him." Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how my friends tried to drown me. By the way, this story is anonymous. That awkward little moment with Sarah, some weeks went by. So she finds me by my locker and she goes, "Hey girl, Raul is letting us borrow his boat for the weekend. Want to come out with us?" I'm like, "Of course I want to go out. Are you kidding me?" The following weekend comes for us to go, and she goes, "Oh, and make sure you don't bring a bathing suit. We're just going to be sitting on the boat." Like, okay. The day comes, and we're all excited, and we're cruising out there. So we get damn near in the middle of the sea, and Sarah turns off the boat. Everyone's looking at me. She goes, "So you like Raul, huh?" I'm like, "Sarah, what's going on?" She goes, "What kind of friend are you? What kind of friend takes their best friend's boyfriend?" I'm like, "First of all, we're not best friends. And second of all, he's not your boyfriend." And her friends then throw me out of the boat. He then tries to run me over. So I stayed under the water and swam away as fast as I could. I got to the land, I called Raul. Once he came and got me, we reported them and they all got expelled.
Story time about how my parents found out I was gay. By the way, this story is anonymous and it's from a boy's perspective. Now, I like boys since I was about 6 years old, and all through school I always felt like something was wrong with me. I was so ashamed and so embarrassed of myself. My dad was completely against LGBTQ, and my mom just kept all of her opinions to herself. So when I was about 17 years old in high school, I was finally ready to start dating somebody. I was just so tired of all my girlfriends talking about all the guys they date. So they encouraged me to finally step up and talk to somebody. So I got a Tinder, and I finally started talking to this one boy who went to another school. Everything was going perfect, so we planned to meet up at a mall. Ever since then, we started hanging out and everything was great. My friends accepted me, he accepted me, so I was finally ready for my parents to accept me. So after a while of me and this boy dating, I finally told him I wanted to tell my parents about us. But before I could even tell them, they already found out. Like for part 2, also follow my Instagram. This is part 2 story time about how my parents found out I was gay. This story is anonymous and it's from a boy's perspective. So I got to a point where I definitely wanted to tell my parents I was gay, but honestly, the thought of it totally freaked me out and I changed my mind. But then my boyfriend started to feel like I was ashamed of him. I didn't want him to feel like that anymore, so I told my parents about us. I was going to tell my parents, but just not when he wanted me to. So one morning from school, my boyfriend came to pick me up with Starbucks. He knocked on the door and my dad opened it. He goes, "Hi, is Chris here?" which is my name. He says, "Yes, and who are you?" He says, "I'm William, Chris's boyfriend." My dad tells him to come inside and he calls me downstairs. So once I come downstairs and I see him, my jaw dropped. He says, "Are you gay?" Then William goes, "You didn't tell him?" I said, "I'm so sorry, I meant to." My dad goes, "Spent all this time raising you just so you could turn into a FHE?" Then my dad throws me out the house. William later understood how I felt. My mom later divorced him and brought me back home.
Part 1 story time about how my own mother was preventing me from having kids. This story is anonymous. Not gonna lie, in high school, your girl was kind of fast. My mom and I, we did not have the best relationship. She always called me a whore and she told me she was gonna put me on birth control as soon as she got good insurance. So sooner than later, I was on birth control. I snuck around with all types of dudes. I thought being on birth control gave me a pass to do whatever I wanted. And my mom never stopped me. She just didn't want to be bothered by me. So as some years went on, boom, I was in college. So I met this guy, Jared, and he was perfect. Me and my mother were never close, so she didn't think I changed since high school. So after college was over, I brought Jared home to meet my parents. My mom liked him and everything, but then she pulled me aside and told me something later. My mom then told me, "You need to stay your ass on birth control. I don't care who you meet. Knowing how you are, you might cheat on him and have babies with everybody on campus." That was hurtful, but I already made up my mind to get off. Like for part 2. Part 2 story time about how my mother was preventing me from having kids. This story is anonymous. So I told my mom, no matter what she thought, I made up my mind already. I'm off birth control. So she's like, "Yeah, we'll see about that." I'm like, "We ain't gonna see about nothing. I'm off." So Jared and I decided to stay with my mom until we found jobs, apartments, etc. Due to some things Jared did when he was a teenager, it was making it hard for him to get a job. Long story short, we were there for a few years. As soon as we graduated college, we had been trying to have a baby, and it just wasn't working. I told my mom about it, but she said, "Don't waste your time going to the hospital. The only reason you can't have kids is because you're stressed out." So we kept trying some months later, but after a while I was tired of it. I snuck and went to a hospital. The doctors ran some tests, and they then told me I was on a hormonal birth control. I sped my ass home so fast. I told my mom what the doctor told me, and then she confessed that she was crushing it up in my food every day. I had never felt so betrayed. And since that was very much illegal, best believe she went and did time. 6 months later, I was pregnant.
Story time about how my boyfriend broke up with me to marry my mother. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. Yes, my boyfriend actually did marry my mom. A little backstory on him. He and I had been dating for 6 months. We decided we wanted to move in together, but neither of us had a job. So we ended up moving in with my mother. A little backstory on my mom. Her and I never got along when I was growing up. I mean, it would get to the point where we would throw hands. Every single week she had a new boyfriend. Most of the time her boyfriends would come live with us and she would pay for everything. She even asked me to get a job so that I could help support her and her boyfriend. I started working at a restaurant. And yeah, I helped her pay for bills. I would even buy her boyfriend his beer. When I got accepted into college, I decided I would move out. After that, I barely spoke to my mom. Fast forward to when my boyfriend and I move in with her. She would wear lingerie around the house and constantly flirt with my boyfriend. I had to tell her on several occasions to cover up and just leave him alone. But here's the thing, it never bothered my boyfriend. In fact, he would flirt back. I thought he was just joking. Until a few months passed and he breaks up with me. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my boyfriend broke up with me to marry my mother. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So like I said in part 1, we moved into my mom's house and she was wearing lingerie all the time. And she would constantly flirt with my boyfriend. My boyfriend was having a really hard time finding a job, but luckily I found a job. So I started working as a personal assistant. The problem is that as a personal assistant, you have to be on call almost 24/7. So I was usually never home, and sometimes when I would get home, I'd have to go right back out. This allowed for my mom and my boyfriend to spend a lot of time together by themselves. I would come home and they would be watching movies on the couch together. My mom would always cook him dinner, and then I started finding out stuff. For example, I found out they went to the movies together and they didn't invite me. I only found out because my boyfriend used our joint bank account to pay for the tickets. Sometimes they would order food for themselves and not even offer me any. And they would have beach days. They were spending way too much time together. At first I thought this was good because it meant they got along, but the more my mom dressed provocatively, the more I realized she was trying to seduce him. Then my boyfriend breaks up with me and tells me that I should move out because him and my mom fell in love. Part 3 of how my boyfriend broke up with me to marry my mother. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So one day my boyfriend breaks up with me and tells me that I should move out. And when I asked him why, he said that him and my mother fell in love. But since I was already suspecting something, it didn't really surprise me. But of course I was still devastated. That's when he asked me if I could move out that same night. Mind you, I don't have any money or even a place to go to. That's when I run over to my mom's room and guess what? She had locked herself inside. The coward didn't even want to face her own daughter. She told me that the best thing for everyone was for me to move out and that she knew I could get back up on my feet. So I grabbed some of my stuff and I went over to my best friend's house. My best friend invited me to live with her, thank God. A few weeks later, my mom invites me to her wedding with my boyfriend, or ex I should say. Last I heard, she's doing OnlyFans and my ex is living off of her. I have a better job, I'm thriving and have my own apartment. Story time about how I got bullied my last year of high school by the most popular girl. Okay, so this is my story time. A lot of you requested one, but I'm also at the airport, so sorry for any noise. So most of my high school years were spent in Nicaragua, except for my last year of high school. You see, I booked a show in Miami, so I had to move to the US. I was also doing modeling, commercials, and a lot of radio. I enrolled in the local high school and it was like literally culture shock for me. I had never experienced an American high school, American parties, or even like actually mingled with American kids. I was really shocked to see how like adult they were. For example, boys and girls were doing adult things. I was constantly being invited to parties where people were drinking, but I never actually went. So the most popular girl in school decided to befriend me in quotation marks. By the way, there were so many times where I spent lunch in the bathroom like Caddy from Mean Girls. It was like Mean Girls, but real life. So this popular girl, she was also a model, and we kind of bonded over that. But behind my back, she had a bet to see which boy would take me to prom. She wanted to see how far this boy could get with me, if you know what I mean. Part 2 might not be up, sorry. Part 2 of how I got bullied by the most popular girl in school. This is my story time. So this popular girl who befriended me had a bet with boys to see which one would take me to prom. Specifically because she wanted to see how far they would get with me on prom night, if you know what I mean. I kept saying no to every single boy. Because I was the new girl, I was constantly getting hit on, but a lot of these boys had girlfriends. Well, since I said no to every single boy, this mean girl decided to print out flyers of the show that I was in. So basically the poster of the show. And when I got to school the next day, there were so many posters of me on the walls, on the floor, with a lot of things drawn on my face. They were even in the boys' locker room. Then someone made up the rumor that I did that, because supposedly I wanted everyone to know that I was a working actress. I was really embarrassed, but at the same time, I kind of thought it was funny, and this really upset the popular girl. So she decided to take it a step further. She invited me to her house one day, and because I thought she was my friend, I decided to go. She cooked me pasta and we talked for a while. Then 2 boys show up. She told me one of them would be my prom date. Part 3 of how I got bullied by the most popular girl in school. This is my story, by the way. So I'm at the popular girl's house, and suddenly 2 boys show up and she says one of them was my date. That's when I told her that I did not want to date for prom. And then the boy asked to speak to me. I talked to him and I told him that I definitely did not want to go on a date with him and that I didn't even know him. That's when he told me that my friend had set everything up, and she told him that I liked him a lot. Well, I told him that that was not true and I basically went home. A few days later, she started a rumor saying that I was totally in love with her and that I forced her to kiss me. Yeah, she's crazy. That's when people started calling me horrible names. But the joke's on her because I was so used to getting bullied in Nicaragua. After school one day, she comes up to me and starts telling me why she doesn't like me. She was so angry she started to cry. She said that she was the pretty girl and then she was the model in school. I literally just walked away from her. I went to prom with no date, which was so fun. I graduated and then I kept working. Guess who slid into my DMs a few weeks ago asking to hang out? That's right, the popular girl. I think she must have seen my TikTok or something. Should I actually go out with her and tell her what I think? Or should I just leave her on red? You guys decide.
When I was 15 years old, I found out I was pregnant with twins. My boyfriend at the time was 21 and had nothing to do with me. When he knew I wasn't going to give them up for adoption or abortion, he walked away. My mom was disappointed, but she helped me throughout my entire pregnancy and my delivery. A few weeks before my due date, my boyfriend texted me saying he broke up with this girl and that he wanted to get together and he was going to try to become the best dad he can. After the twins were born, it was blissful for a few moments until my mother started becoming toxic. She would take them places without my knowledge, and I would wake up to an empty house not knowing where my kids were. She started overriding my decisions, and when I confronted her, she told me she knew better because she was an adult, and I was in no position to contradict her. After years of this happening, I finally had enough, and I managed to get enough money to afford a hotel for a couple of nights while I decided what to do. I asked my aunt to watch my kids for a few days so I can go out and find a job. And when I returned to the motel, they were gone. All of them. When I returned back to the hotel, my twins and my aunt are missing. No phone call, no message, no nothing. Coincidentally, my mom calls and says that my best friend told her that my twins were missing, even though I told no one. She was yelling at me on the phone saying she was so worried and it was obviously my fault because I was so young. And at that point, I was really suspicious because I could hear my aunt in the background talking to my mom. So at that point, I knew she took them to my mom's house. As soon as I hung up on the phone, I went to the police station to file a report. For a few days, the police went undercover to try to get evidence, and there was many pictures showing my mom taking my twins to their house. When we took her to court, she said that they ran away due to my abuse and she found them in the middle of the street, which was obviously a complete lie. My mom had paid my boyfriend to give her false information that I was hurting my kids. After a long and gruesome battle, I won the case and my mom can't see them until they're 18. Even though my boyfriend at the time had a major part in it, he only has visitation limitations, which is once every 6 weeks. This happened 3 years ago when I was 18. I'm now married to the love of my life and the best father in the world.
This is why you should be extremely careful when meeting up with someone you met online. When I was 18, I was freshly single and ready to mingle. I had a dating profile on that website, Plenty of Fish. One day I got a message from a guy who was 8 to 10 years older than me. At that time, I didn't care about age, so I messaged back. The initial plan was to meet at the movie theater, but while I was getting ready, he asked if I could come to his apartments and we could go to the theater together. Not thinking much of it, I agreed and headed over. The address he sent me was about 35 minutes out, but I really didn't mind making the drive. On the way there, I had this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach, but I just chalked it up to being nervous. However, the closer I got, the more this feeling grew. You know that feeling when you feel like something really bad's about to happen? When I was about 5 minutes away, I decided to call my best friend and tell her how I was feeling. She told me that if I'm feeling this way, then I probably shouldn't go inside his apartment and that I should text him. When I got there, I parked outside of his apartment building and I shot him a text. I told him I wasn't comfortable coming inside and if we could just meet at the movies. This is when he started flipping out on me. He said I told him I would come inside, so I needed to come inside, and that he was going to come and get me and I had nothing to be afraid of. This is when things got crazy. Part 2 of why you should be careful when meeting up with someone you met online. He kept trying to get me to go inside of his apartment despite me telling him that I wanted to meet at a public place like we originally planned. He told me to stop being weird and to come inside because I was already there. At this point, I went with my gut feeling, apologized, and told him that I didn't want to see him. This is when he went ballistic. He started cursing me out and telling me that I wasted his only day off. He told me he was already on his way outside to come and get me. As I was looking down at my phone and texting him back, someone tried to open my car door from the outside. Luckily, I always keep my doors locked. I looked up and it was him. That's when he told me to open the door and that I was going to come inside with him. I was mortified with shock, so I didn't respond right away. He punched my driver's side window and told me to open the effing door. I immediately started my car and booked it while he was yelling at me. As I was driving home and terrified and trying to catch my breath, he texted me nonstop. He told me that I needed to make this up to him and to meet him at a park with a skirt on. I made it clear that I was never going to do that or see him again, and that if he kept contacting me, I was going to contact the police. He kept texting me, so I blocked his number. Always trust your gut, share your location with your best friend, and meet in a public place.
Story time of how my best friend was catfished by my dad. So me and my best friend were kind of just like swiping through Tinder for fun. And then she came across this really, really hot dude. So of course, she swiped right and they talked all night long. And he said he had an Android so he couldn't FaceTime, but his messages were blue, so I thought something was off. She was too blinded to see that something was up in the first place because she was messaging with a really hot guy. So about a week of them just like texting back and forth and I guess getting to know each other, they decided that they were going to meet up. So they both decided that they were going to meet up at an Olive Garden near them. And you see, as her best friend, of course, I'm going to have to go with her. So I got dressed up and I sat about 5 tables away from her. And we got there about 30 minutes earlier than we were supposed to be there. Okay, so my best friend had 3 bowls of fettuccine alfredo before he got there. So when he got there, it wouldn't look like she ate a lot. Then I see my dad walk in, all dressed up and fancy with a bow tie and everything. This story time just gets so much more funnier, so like for a part 2. Part 2 of how my best friend was catfished by my dad. Continuing with the story, I see my dad walk into the restaurant all dressed up. Mind you, my dad's married. To my mother, of course. So I was like, ooh, my dad and my mom are finally going on a date together. And then he looks over to my best friend and walks over to the table. When I tell you my heart dropped, my heart has never sank so deep inside me so fast. He sits down and asks her, is this Mackenzie? When I tell you I busted out laughing so freaking hard I fell out of my chair. And almost everybody in the restaurant turned around and looked at me, and so did my dad. And I walk over to the table and I'm like, what the heck is going on here? My best friend is literally just sitting there in shock, no emotion on her face. Then he looks at us, he looks really confused, his face goes blank, and then he goes, I was just trying to teach y'all girls a lesson. I told my mom and I was just getting a laugh out of it, and then she looked through his phone and said that he was meeting up with a bunch of 14-year-old girls. So comes to find out, my dad is a pedophile. My mom kicked him out, and if you're one of those girls, I really do apologize.
Over 4 months ago, I gave birth to my 4th and last child. It was a high-risk pregnancy, and the birth was very difficult. My doctors advised me not to have any more kids, and I agreed. My husband had a vasectomy, and now he's recovering. My little sister's been trying to have a family for a while now, but she recently found out that she can't conceive. My family suggested surrogacy or adoption, but my sister said that she would have to think about it. She called me a few nights ago and told me that she's decided on surrogacy with her boyfriend. That's when she brought up the fact how I had done so well with all my pregnancies and how I must love being pregnant. I knew exactly where this was going and reminded her how my last pregnancy was, and yet she told me everything was fine now, so what's my issue? I told her just because I'm fine now doesn't mean that I'll be fine next time. That's when she straight up asked me if I'll be her surrogate or not, and I told her no, and that I didn't want to leave my kids without a mother or my husband a widow. She went ballistic on the phone and called me selfish and a bitch and wouldn't stop. The next morning my phone was blowing up with notifications and everyone, including our mother, was against me. So am I being selfish because I'm not putting my own health at risk to give her a baby?
My sister made a Facebook post basically saying that I'm selfish because I have 4 kids, but I won't be her surrogate and help her have a baby. My mom and a small handful of people are extremely angry at me, calling me all sorts of names for being selfish. On the other hand, several others, including my dad and my brothers, are taking my side, which is why I made my own Facebook post. I explained my situation and how it would be a high-risk pregnancy and the complications I had with my last child. Several people tagged my sister in my post to tell her off, but she blocked everyone and then called and screamed at me for putting personal information on Facebook. Then my sister's boyfriend called me and apologized. He had no idea that she had asked me, and he even offered to find surrogacy with her, but she always complained that it was too much. My mom never commented or said anything on my post, but then I asked her to lunch and she agreed. When I arrived, she started telling me off for going on Facebook to complain. Apparently this is a family matter and should be talked about privately. I then asked her how my body was a family matter. All she said was, "I made you, so it's a family matter." This is when things got intense. I asked my mom what would happen to my kids if something happened to me, and all she said was, "They will live." I could not believe the stubbornness of this woman. I then went on to tell her that whether they lived or not, it was still going to break them. My oldest child would go back to her dad, and the younger 3 would stay with my husband. Separating them would break them even more. And once again, she said that they would live. Then she went on to tell me that I need to do the right thing for my family because it's not that big of a deal and I need to grow up and act like an adult. At this point, I was so upset that I got up, left, and cried the whole way home. Not long after, my dad showed up at my doorstep and asked if he could stay for a while. After lunch, my mom told him that I was still refusing to do a simple task for my sister. That's when he told her off for not thinking about all her kids instead of her golden child, and things could be worse this time for me. My mom told him that it's my fault for not looking after myself. And after this, my dad left her. My dad has been living with me since he left my mom, and the kids and my husband love having him around. I know he will eventually try talking to my mom again, but whether they get back together or not just depends. In all honesty, it seems like my mom doesn't care, and if they do divorce, I'll probably be the one to blame.
Storytime about how my boyfriend was cheating on me with my stepsister. So a little background information, my mom remarried whenever I was in 8th grade, and my stepdad had 2 daughters. One which was my age and we got along really well. Well, before my sisters and I went back to school, my mom wanted to go on a camping trip with everyone. And my boyfriend was coming because he was really close with my family. So while my stepsister and I are packing up, she starts acting really weird. And we're gonna call my boyfriend Kevin. She was like, "Oh, is Kevin still coming with us?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then she goes, "Oh, are you and Kevin still together?" And I'm like, "We were never broken up. Like, the fuck?" Like I said, she was just being super fucking weird. But anyways, we all get in the car, we drive up there, and her and Kevin start being super weird around each other. Like, they were being too touchy. Anytime that I wanted to go do something with Kevin, she would say, "Oh, Kevin, you can come do this instead." Well, that night, Kevin and I are sleeping in our tent. At least I thought he was. And I wake up to some loud noises in the other tent, like for part 2. Part 2. So like I said, I heard a bunch of noises and talking in my stepsister's tent, and I wake up and my boyfriend isn't in the tent. So I'd be very quiet getting out of my tent, and I go over to hers and I just listen. And oh bitch, I should have just confronted them because I got my motherfucking feelings hurt. He was telling her how he didn't love me at all and how he only wanted to be with her, and how every time that they kissed each other and screwed each other, he felt such a connection between them. So not only was he cheating physically, but they had a connection. Wonderful. So I open her tent and I confront them. This was the most degrading thing I've ever went through in my life. And I said, "I heard you guys outside. And I'm just not the type of girl who's going to come at another girl because my man wants her. Because at that point, he's not my man." She goes, "Sit down, sweetie. We need to talk." Apparently, they're in love. So they started dating. They're still dating. And my parents allowed it. So I distanced myself from all of them.
This is why you should be extremely careful when someone offers to buy you a drink. I went to a punk show in LA with my brother and his best friend. The band I wanted to see wasn't playing yet, so I hit the bar to go grab a drink. That's when this really cute guy approached me and started talking to me. We got to talking and we were vibing for a while. After about 30 minutes, he asked if I wanted to get a beer and I said sure. I watched him buy it and open it right in front of me. He said he was getting hot and asked if I wanted to go outside and get some air with him. I politely said no because I didn't know if they would let us back in, but he kept insisting. At this point, I had drank half my beer and I was ready to go meet back up with my brother. I let him know and I got up, but that's when I started feeling really weird. As I was looking for my brother, I started to get really dizzy. That's when I felt someone's hand on my shoulder. I clumsily whipped around to check and it was the guy from the bar. That's when he said, "I told you we need to get some air. Let's go to my car." At this point, my body felt so weak, I could barely stand. It was hard to think, let alone reply. That's when he put his arm under my shoulder and was carrying me towards the exit. As we were getting closer to the exit, a deep panic started to set in my stomach. I couldn't talk or walk, but I could still see and hear everything around me. Right before we reached the exit, something amazing happened. Part 2 of why you should be extremely careful when someone offers to buy you a drink. At this moment, I felt like the unluckiest, but also the luckiest person in the world. A group of girls noticed that I was barely able to walk and this guy was practically dragging me out towards the exit. One of them walked over and asked what was going on. The others followed. That's when he said that we were friends and that I drank too much and he was giving me a ride home. The girls looked over to me and asked me if he was my friend. At this point, I couldn't even respond. I couldn't even form words to tell them no. Again, he insisted that everything is fine and he's trying to take me home, but the girls were not having it. They said that since I wasn't responding, they wouldn't let him take me. That's when he tried to push past them, but they stopped him and told him if he does it again, they're going to have to fight him. Luckily, my brother and his best friend had been looking for me and they saw what was going on. The group of girls told my brother everything that was happening. My brother told the girls to watch me, and him and his friend dragged the guy outside instead. My brother taught him a lesson that he'll never forget outside and then came back for me. Since we were 30 blocks from home and I couldn't walk, my brother and his friend put me in a shopping cart and took me home. We never got to see the band that we went there for, but I made it home safe and that's all that matters. This is why you should think twice about moving in with your friends. My friend Amy and I decided to get an apartment together. We've been friends for a while and she's the type of friend that I could never get sick of and always hang out with. The first issue we had was when she started bringing her boyfriend over a few nights a week, which was fine at first. However, he started coming over more frequently to the point where he was there 6 nights a week. Her boyfriend also always parked in my designated spot, leaving me nowhere to park. On top of that, Amy and I decided we would go shopping together for food every few weeks and split the grocery bill. But her boyfriend is over constantly eating all the food that we bought, and this guy can eat. Amy also complained that the AC bill is too high and we need to stop turning down the temperature so much, and I quote, open the windows and rough it. I went to work one day and came back and the apartment felt almost as hot as it was outside, which was over 100 degrees. My dog lives with us, so I always try to keep the apartment cool. I immediately checked on him and went to turn on the AC. But to my shock, Amy had taken the control panel off of the wall and hid it so I couldn't adjust the temperature. I called her furious and explained to her that she could have killed my dog, to which she replied, I'm not going to leave the AC on all day when we're gone for a stupid dog. This is when things took a turn for the worse. Part 2, why you should think twice about moving in with your friends. After everything that happened, I knew I needed to get out and start looking for another arrangement. The next night I came home late after studying with some friends. I went straight to my room, turned on the lights, and almost had a heart attack when I saw a guy laying in my bed in just his boxers. I started screaming and freaking out, and that's when Amy rushed into the room. She said it was her boyfriend's friend that got too drunk when they went out and he needed to sleep it off. I couldn't believe she put this passed out drunk disgusting guy in my bed. At this point I was seeing red and I was about to fight her. But I left to my mom's for the night before I did anything I would regret. That same night one of my friends sent me a screenshot. Amy had posted in a local Facebook group about how she's looking for a new roommate to replace her horrible current roommate. I couldn't believe that in her mind, I was the horrible one. The next day I took some friends and packed up all of my things. While I was packing, Amy had the audacity to come into the room and ask me if I was still going to pay for next month's rent. When I refused, she tried to guilt trip me into telling me if I want to keep our friendship, then I need to pay. I told her that nothing could save our friendship at this point and I left. I haven't talked to her since.
Here's a story time of how me and my sisters almost got kidnapped. So my mom and her boyfriend were just going to go out and have a night to themselves, and I was home watching my 2 little sisters. At the time, I was 13, my 2 little sisters were 9 and 6. So around 6 p.m., my mom and her boyfriend leave. Me and my sisters just sit down and watch a movie, and then I get up to make them dinner. I get paranoid really easily, and while I was making them dinner, I look out the kitchen window, and I thought I seen somebody in the backyard. I text my mom and she gets on the cameras that are outside and she said nobody was out there. I continue making them dinner, we sit down and eat, and then we start watching another movie. Then we start hearing knocking. It wasn't coming from any of the doors, it was coming from the side of the house. I didn't want to bother my mom on her one night out, so I just took the kids and we went upstairs and watched a movie in my room. My 6-year-old sister at the time went to the bathroom and she came back in literal tears. She was literally crying so hard until I finally got her to stop and tell me what was wrong. She said as she was walking back from the bathroom, she seen somebody downstairs. I quietly locked my door and I put my sisters in the closet and I called my mom right away. I'm running out of time, like for part 2. Part 2 of how me and my sisters almost got kidnapped. I called my mom and then she looked on the cameras downstairs and somebody was in the house. She never told me what the person was doing. I guess she just didn't want me worrying, but she called 911 right away. While my 2 little sisters were in the closet, my 6-year-old sister would not stop crying and I'm pretty sure the person downstairs heard her. At this time, my mom and her boyfriend were already on the way and so were the police. I heard him coming up the steps, so I quietly opened the closet door and promised my sisters that they would stay quiet and be calm no matter what. I didn't know what he was here for, so I hid in the side of the bed in front of the closet so that he would get to me before he got to the girls. I heard him just rummaging through stuff and stuff breaking. Then a couple minutes later, I hear the police sirens. Right as I hear the police sirens, I hear our bedroom window smash. While trying to stay as calm as I can, 3 policemen bust down the door. They grab me and my sisters and take us outside. About 5 minutes after they take us outside and put us in the back of their car, my mom and her boyfriend shows up. About 20 minutes later after he was caught, they did notify us that he was wanted for murder of 2 younger girls and 1 adult male. About $10,000 of our stuff was either missing or broke. Then about a month later when we were capable to, we did move. Nothing has.
My boyfriend showed up to my house randomly one day. I had just woken up and I got ready so fast in my room. Mom told him that he could wait in the living room. She ended up jumping in the shower. I went outside to the living room and we ended up going to his house. And I was there. My mom called me. She said that there was $350 on the table and that one $50 bill was missing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I had to find out the truth. So I told him to take me to Jack in the Box. We went through the drive-thru. I was so mad, but I had to keep it together. I knew that he only paid with 20s. He never paid with 50s. I ordered my food and I was waiting to see what bill he pulled out. And guess what, guys? It was a $50 bill. Then I looked at him and told him, don't pay with my mom's money. I grabbed my purse, pulled out a 20, and told him, pay with my money. His eyes just popped open. He knew he got caught. After I found out that he stole from my mom, I told him to pay with my money, right? And he just got very defensive, started telling me that what was I talking about? He tried to play it dumb. And I told him, you know what I'm talking about. And he said that he didn't know, so I explained to him that $50 were missing. And he was just like, I would never do something like that. How could you say that? If you guys really need the money, then here you go. And he ended up handing me the money. And I was like, dude, just say the truth. Say that it was you. And he was just like, no, keep the money. And I kept that because that's my mom's money. She was supposed to pay one of her bills with that. And the reason why I didn't tell him on the spot when my mom called me was because I didn't want to accuse him and then him say that he didn't do it. I'd rather just see it myself and confirm it. Thanks to the drive-thru at Jack in the Box, I knew that this man was a thief and a liar.
Story time about how I caught my best friend with my ex-boyfriend just a few weeks after we broke up. We became friends in middle school and were inseparable ever since. My boyfriend and I met when we were 20 and we were together for 3 years. I'm not a strong drinker, so whenever we would go out, I would usually be the DD. My best friend used this opportunity to get extremely wasted every time we went out. Every time she got drunk, she would be extremely flirty with my boyfriend. She would do things like touch his chest, lean on him, and want to be in every picture or video he took. I chalked it up to her being drunk and didn't think too much into it. Fast forward to when me and my ex finally broke up. My best friend encouraged me to break up with him and told me that I deserved better. Shortly after, I noticed that she was hiding things from me and not telling me where she was or who she was hanging out with. Whenever we kicked it, she was always on her phone nonstop, and when I looked over, she would hide her phone or turn it over. One day I looked over and I noticed my ex's name as the contact that she was texting. I let it go that night, and the next day I checked her Snap location. Her location was in my ex's neighborhood, so I texted her and asked her what she was up to. She tried to play it off by saying she was shopping with her mom. At this point, all I saw was red. I decided to grab my keys and go over to my ex's house. Part 2 of catching my best friend with my ex-boyfriend a few weeks after we broke up. So my ex had a habit of not locking his doors, and when I went up to the door, guess what? It wasn't locked. I quietly let myself in and made my way up to his bedroom. I could already hear noises coming from the bedroom, so I knew what was up. Or so I thought I did. Imagine my surprise when I flung the door open and saw my best friend not with one, not with two, but 3 guys, and one of them being my ex. The look on her face when I walked in and saw her was priceless. I should also mention that I was recording all of this, so I got it all on video. My best friend ran after me with a blanket around her. At first, she was apologetic and begging for forgiveness. But after noticing that I was pretty much done with the friendship, she started being a huge bitch. She started calling me names and telling me it's not her fault that my ex likes her better because she's not vanilla like me. The next thing I did was really petty, but at the moment I didn't care. I texted the video I had of her to her sister and let her know what was going on. That's when she went into a full-on rage and tried to swing on me. I dodged it, yanked the towel, and slapped her right back. I left her on the lawn looking stupid and naked. All of our friends took my side and I never heard from her again.
This is a story time on how I almost got kidnapped. So one day when I was younger, maybe like 13, 14, I went out to go get the mail while my parents weren't home. And I already knew I wasn't supposed to be going outside when I was not home, but I did this every day and my parents knew about it, or so I thought. So I go out to get the mail and there's this white old man across the street. When I reach the mailbox, this man starts yelling at me. He's like, hey, come here. And I live on a busy street, so he was across the street on a sidewalk. So I get so scared and I literally dart back into the house. I'm pretty sure I forgot the mail. I get back in the house, I lock the door, and I run upstairs to my room and I call my aunt who lives right around the corner like 7 times and she does not answer, not once. So I hurry up and I call my dad, and by this time this man is at my house banging on my door yelling at me to come out. I look out the window and he is literally walking around my house seeing if I went to the backyard. I'm not sure if he didn't see me go into my house, but he's walking to see if I'm around back. I get a hold of my dad and he immediately leaves work and tells me to stay on the phone with him. Read the caption for part 2. Sheesh, y'all are ruthless. Part 2. So while I was on the phone with my dad, my aunt called me back and I answered the phone for her. I told her everything that was going on. She said that she wasn't answering because she was in the bathtub, but she was on her way right now. So I called my dad back, and all at the same moment, I'm looking outside the window to make sure this guy's not trying to get into my house. My aunt arrives about 5 minutes later and she gets out of the car. I'm watching her through the window the whole time. She picks up a brick from around my house and she goes literally around the entire house with the brick to make sure that nobody's there. My aunt is just short little thing, so I didn't know what she thinks she was about to do, but she had it down. So I end up leaving with her and she ends up driving around to go try to find this guy because he had already left by the time she got there. We drove to the corner store and the guy was actually there, and I ducked down in the back seat because I thought if he seen me that he was going to hurt me or something. I'm not sure. Ended up walking across the street, and that's when my parents arrived and then the police arrived. I don't know what happened to the guy, but I got in trouble.
Story time of how my neighbors were killed and we all heard. I live in a middle to low class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing happens. It's the type of place that people go to retire and sip pina coladas all day. However, a few houses next to mine lived a family that was not like the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the smallest girl we nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was my best friend and she was always at my house. On Tiny's birthday, her parents threw a giant party for her and all the neighborhood kids were invited. They had bouncy houses, water slides, and everything a kid would want to play with, but my parents wouldn't let me go. I never knew why. I suppose it was because my mom didn't know her mom. After the birthday, things went back to normal, and one day we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what they did except that their dad traveled a lot and was always at meetings. I didn't pay much attention and we all continued on with our day. One night, we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops and screams coming from Tiny's house. I will never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mom, came out rushing us inside yelling that it was gunshots. She locked us inside the house and I couldn't believe what happened next. Part 2 of how my neighbors were killed and we all heard. After hearing gunshots, we stayed locked in my house while the next door neighbor, who was a cop, ran towards Tiny's place. Then we saw a black van rushing down the street trying to get away. Tiny and her siblings wanted to check what was going on, but everyone forbade them to go. All I remember was a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later, and after that day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a couple months, the house sat empty, but black vans and strange men kept coming into the neighborhood. They went door to door asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it, and as years passed, the story faded away. Now that I'm grown up, I asked my neighbor the cop what went down that night. He said that night, Tiny's dad got a gun emptied in his skull and his wife was gravely wounded, but she survived. Apparently, he was a drug lord that was going to make a deal with the police to turn in rival gangs and some other people to the cops. The men in the van that were going door to door wanted to know where his kids and wife were to also shut them up. Tiny's oldest brother was found dead in a neighboring town, his car set ablaze. Tiny and her siblings are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope wherever she is, she's doing okay and her family got the help that they needed.
You guys are not even gonna believe this. This is a story time about how I caught my sister's boyfriend hooking up with our Nana. It was summer of 2019 and me, my boyfriend, my Nana, my sister, and my sister's boyfriend all decided to plan a trip to France. A few days before we were supposed to leave though, my sister got really ill and so she decided to stay home. She didn't see any problem with her boyfriend still going though since she trusted him. And they basically grew up together. Anyways, a few days into our trip, my Nana ended up having a heat stroke. We had a whole day plan of going to the beach and shopping and we asked if she wanted to come, but she insisted that my sister's boyfriend stay with her and take care of her. And he said he didn't mind because there was plenty of other days that he could go to the beach while we were in France. My Nana and him always got along and talked a lot, so we didn't really see a problem with it either. So my boyfriend and I left, and we didn't get our usual update for our Nana, so after a few hours, we decided to come back. We walked back to the hotel, and we noticed that the door was locked. We knew that there was a key inside, and we kept knocking to get their attention, but no one ever answered the door. We were really worried, so we ran down to the front desk to grab an extra key. And that's when we were finally able to open the door. Follow, share, and add me on Instagram, and I'll do a part 2. Hey guys, and welcome back for part 2 of my grandma hooking up with my sister's boyfriend. So we were finally able to open up the door to the hotel room, and we all immediately had the worst feeling. Honestly, I thought maybe she wasn't okay or something had happened to her. So my boyfriend and I went to go open up the bedroom door, and there she was with my sister's boyfriend. We were totally stunned and I just about fainted. I obviously immediately had to tell my sister, so I picked up the phone to call her, and you're never gonna believe what she said. She was like, yeah, I already knew about this, and that's why we had taken a break before. So she had literally walked in on her boyfriend and our grandma hooking up before, and she still proceeded to date him. So the moral of the story is, don't date someone who isn't 1000% head over heels for you, because they might end up getting with your grandma.
Story time about how my fiance broke off our wedding because of my best friend. My fiance and I had been together for 2 years, but my best friend and I had been friends for over 8 years. So I trusted her with my life. When my fiance and I met, she approved and she loved him. She was always looking for a new relationship because she could never commit to anyone. Eventually, I started feeling like she was envious of the relationship because I had found someone that I truly loved and that wanted to marry me. On the other hand, she was a serial dater and went out with so many guys she couldn't even keep track. One night we had a double date and she brought this new guy she met. Throughout the whole date, my fiance and my best friend were hitting it off, talking, making jokes, and I was actually really happy because I was happy they got along. Her date even noticed this and commented about how we should switch dates. I thought it was so funny. Well, little did I know that after that night, they actually started texting every once in a while. Inside jokes and memes, stuff like that. I did know about it, and I thought it was really cute, and I was so happy that they were getting along. After all, she was going to be the godmother of our future children. One day I saw she sent him a picture through text message. You'll never guess what I found. Come back for part 2. So I noticed my best friend sent my fiance a picture, and he was in the bathroom, so I went ahead and opened the picture. You guys, it was a selfie of her wrapped in a towel fresh out of the shower. So of course I show it to him, and he's like, oh my god, why would she send that? He totally played it off like he had no idea why she would send that to him. So I call my best friend and I say, hey, did you just send my fiance this picture? She hesitated for a second, and then she's like, oh my god, please don't tell me I sent him the picture by mistake. And I was like, yeah, you sent him a picture of you in a towel. And she said, I'm so mortified, I'm so sorry, I meant to send it to somebody else. And then she's like, you believe me, right? And part of me didn't want to, but part of me had to. I couldn't believe that my best friend would do that, so I said, yeah, of course I believe you. And she completely changed the subject and told me about the guy that she was currently seeing, who she actually meant to send the picture to. A few weeks passed by, and my fiance says he has to go on a work trip. Weirdly enough, she said she was going to go on a trip with the guy that she had just met. I asked her to meet the guy before they actually went on a trip, and she said no, because he's really shy. Can you believe they went on this trip together? Come back for part 3. Part 3. So my best friend and my fiance go on a trip by themselves behind my back. The whole time they were on their trips, I thought he was on a work trip, and I thought she was with some dude. Because of the time difference, my fiance kept saying that he couldn't FaceTime, so we would just talk on the phone. The conversations were really short, and he was acting really strange. He told me he was on a work trip to London, and because the whole thing felt so strange, I decided to call his mom. So I call her and I'm like, hey, where did he travel to again? And she replied, Aruba. I didn't say anything to her, and I just got off the phone. I knew he was lying. And I knew my best friend was in Aruba. I connected the dots and realized they were both on a vacation together. The day that he was supposed to fly in, I showed up to the airport knowing that he was coming from Aruba, and I see them walking out to arrivals hand in hand. They saw me right away, and my best friend literally ran away. That's when he told me that he no longer wanted to be with me and that he wanted to be with my best friend. I'd already paid for the wedding. He was such a coward. 2 months later, I found out she cheated on him, and he came back to me. I said no.